If you've got a Bible this morning, we're in the book of Acts in a series called Form and Fire. This morning I was tasked with talking about the Apostle Paul. In this chapter he's called Saul, and it's found in Acts chapter 9 if you have a Bible. If not, we've got a Bible provided for you on the screen behind me. A few years ago I was in Portland with some friends. And while we were in Portland, which is the food capital of America, we went to this really fancy restaurant that was very upscale, a bit pretentious, and to be honest, way out of my budget, but when in Rome, right? And so we go to this really nice restaurant, and the way that the restaurant is set up, it's all shared plates. It's family style, and one of the things that they're trying to focus on is farm-to-table sustainability, right? And so on the menu was literally under each dish, it described how far the farm was from the restaurant. It told you about the happy life that the cow lived before you ate it, which is very morbid and weird, but that was their vibe. And so we're at this really nice restaurant. There's couples there on a date. There's young professionals out on a night on the town. There's just like tons of people, and the atmosphere was electric. It was beautiful. The music, the decor, everything was incredible. And there's a group of guys there, and they're out having a good time. And after a fantastic meal, they're about to leave. I'd imagine they're probably going out for drinks or something afterward. And so they pay their check, and they're about to leave, and one of them goes to the bathroom. And this guy is like dressed to the nines. He looks very sharp. He's got a great haircut, very well put together. And so he goes to the bathroom. When he's finished, he comes out. And he can tell that there's a few people who've noticed him. He can sense their eyes watching him. And so he's walking out of the restaurant with a bit of swagger and a bit of confidence. What he doesn't know is the reason why we're all staring at him isn't because of his, European fashion and an incredible hairdo. It's because he has a long strand of toilet paper stuck to his shoe. And he's walking out of the restaurant, feeling like, he's a hotshot. And poor guy, he walks out of the restaurant. We can see through the window that he walks over to the group of friends waiting for him. They all point down at his shoe and begin to laugh. I'm going to imagine that's not how he planned his night going. The reality is sometimes things don't go the way that we'd expect, right? And this morning, as we're encountering Acts chapter 9, there's a guy named Saul who's persecuting the church. He's against Jesus and his followers, and he's the last person we'd ever expect to become a follower of Jesus. But sometimes things don't go the way that we'd expect. This is what it says in Acts chapter 9, verse 1. It says, "Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples." Apparently there's threats and then there's murderous threats. "He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus so that if he found any there who belonged to the way," that's the way of Jesus, "whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem." So this dude's, a pretty hard guy. This guy named Saul is on his way to Damascus. And as he's on his way there, he has one pursuit, and that is to persecute the Christians. It's to find those who are following the Jewish teacher, the Jewish rabbi, Jesus. And when he finds them, he's going to take them captive as prisoners and arrest them. See, this is the last guy you'd ever expect God to save. This is the last guy you'd ever expect for God to use. But this morning, I want to make it crystal clear to us that God can save anyone. God can save anyone. Last week, Ben talked about the Ethiopian eunuch, a guy who was asking questions, a guy who was seeking, a guy who was looking for God. But here we read about someone who's the opposite of a seeker. Someone who's not asking questions, somebody who's not inquiring about Jesus, rather somebody who's looking to put an end to Jesus and his followers. See, Saul is the last person we think that God would save. He's a zealot. He's a persecutor. He's a scary dude. And any rational mind here this morning would think that if this guy meets Jesus, he is not going to have a good encounter. Jesus is going to have it out on this guy. Jesus is going to give him what he's got coming. We expect him to meet Jesus with resistance and correction. We expect God to put him straight. We expect Saul to get what he deserves. But that's not what happens. See, he encounters Jesus on this road, and he's met with love and grace. It's as if God is pursuing him even in the midst of his sin, because God can save anyone. See, Romans 5:8, the very guy in this passage would later pen these words. God demonstrates his own love for us in this, that even while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. See, God can save anyone. His love pursues us even in the midst of our sin and rebellion. You know, there's just some things you don't really want to save, right? Like my wife will save the craziest things, okay? My wife, after we're having dinner, will save things like a sprig of rosemary or a tablespoon of sauce, and she'll just like put it in the fridge there to die, a slow death, right? And I'm like, you know, why are we saving these things, right? So the other day I was cleaning out our house because I'm a really good husband and that's what I do. And so I'm cleaning out our house and I find these candles that my wife had, you know, put away somewhere. And these candles were burned out. They don't have anything left in them and they're just kind of sitting there. I'm like, why are we saving these? And so I did what any good husband would do, and I threw them out, right? And every husband here is like, dude, wrong call, right? And so I threw them out because there's just some things you don't want to save. But God is a lot more like my wife than he is like me. The Bible says that God's not willing that anyone would perish. The Bible in the Old Testament says repeatedly that God does not take delight in the death of the wicked. See, the things that we would rather God not save, he would rather save. He would, in fact, rather die and save them to not save them at all. And while Saul is on his way to persecute the church, he encounters Jesus. And Jesus is hunting him down to save him. It says this in verse 3. Jesus shows up and speaks to Saul. It says in verse 3, as he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? Saul asked. I am Jesus whom you are persecuting, he replied. Now get up and go into the city and you will be told what you must do. And so here he's encountered by the presence of Jesus, and it actually goes on to say that the light of Jesus is so powerful that it blinds him. Look at verse 7. The men traveling with Saul stood there speechless. I'd be speechless too. They heard the sound but didn't see anyone. Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand into Damascus, and for 3 days he was blind and did not eat or drink anything. This is quite the encounter. Knocked off your donkey and blinded. Imagine that's how you met Jesus, right? It's quite the encounter. So last week, I turned 30. I'm really old now. And I was supposed to hang out with my wife and her siblings. And so we go over to their house. We're going to pick them up and grab bubble tea. And so we show up and the lights are off and no one's home. And so I walk in the door. I'm like, where is everybody? Are you guys like sleeping? Like, hello, anyone home? And I walk into the kitchen and out of nowhere, 20 people yell, surprise. And I'm like, I watched the video after and I don't look surprised. I look terrified, right? Like I'm not smiling at all. I look like totally stunned, like a deer in headlights. This is what happens to Saul. He's on his way to Damascus, and out of nowhere, he's ambushed by Jesus. See, Jesus hunts him down, knocks him off his donkey, and blinds him with the light of his presence. This encounter declares to us boldly that God can save anyone. So this morning, who have you written off? This morning, who have you overlooked? Is it a people group? Is it a specific individual? Who have you considered too far gone for God to save? Or who have you given up on? Isaiah 59:1 declares that surely the arm of the Lord is not too short to save, and his ear is not too dull to hear. God can save anyone. When I was younger, I had a really great career working at A&W. I was really good at making hamburgers. And as I worked there throughout the summer, there was a gas station next door that I would go to on my break. And there was a guy who worked there. His name was Tim. And over the course of a few months during the summer, we got to know each other and we became friends. And, as the months go on, we both got, a little bit of career change and we got different jobs and we fell out of touch. Years later, I ran into Tim for the first time in years, and he asked me what I was up to. At that time, I was living in Florida and going to college, so I came home, and I was reintroduced to him, and he asked me, Dan, what are you up to? And I said, you know what, I'm studying to be a pastor. And he was shocked. I'm like, dude, why do you look so surprised, right? He was so surprised. And he said, Dan, I actually just became a Christian a few weeks ago. I just gave my life to Jesus. And I was just as shocked as he was, right? And apparently we thought that if God was going to save someone, it wouldn't be the two of us, right? It's so easy for us to think God couldn't save that person. It's so easy to write somebody off or to give up on someone, but God can save anyone. See, maybe there's somebody who's betrayed you or hurt you, and you think that not only can God not save them, but he shouldn't save them. Maybe you've prayed for somebody 1,000 times and everything you seem to do hasn't worked up until now. But if only we could see things from God's perspective. God hasn't given up on them. God hasn't written them off. He hasn't turned his back on them. He hasn't looked over them. See, we need to see things from God's perspective, not ours. See, while Saul is running from God and persecuting the church, God is running after Saul. See, our perspective and God's perspective are not always the same. You know, when Adam and Eve sinned against God, they hid in fear of what God would think. They thought that God would be mad at them. They thought that God would judge them. They thought that God would abandon them and betray them and be angry with them. Little did they know that the Father was running after his kids saying, "Where are you?" See, Jesus reveals to us a God who is running after his kids saying, "Where are you?" Jesus came and he said that I have come to seek and to save the lost. God is running after them, and he's running after you this morning. In all of your mess and failure, in all of your sin and rebellion, God is running after you. He's an ever-loving, ever-pursuing God, and he hasn't given up on you. He is running after you, and he can save anyone. See, while you're doing everything possible to run away from God, he is running after you. So this morning, we need to see things from God's perspective, not ours. Saul can't see things from God's perspective. Not until he's knocked off his horse and blinded by the presence of Jesus. Only then can he see Jesus for who he truly is. So this morning, God can save anyone, but he can use anyone. God can use anyone. It says this in verse 10. In Damascus, there was a disciple named Ananias. The Lord called to him in a vision, "Ananias." "Yes, Lord," he answered. The Lord told him, "Go to the house of Judas on Straight Street and ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul, for he is praying. In a vision, he has seen a man named Ananias come place his hands on him to restore his sight." "Lord," Ananias replied, "I have heard many reports about this man and all the harm he has done to your holy people in Jerusalem. And he has come here with the authority from the chief priests to arrest all who call on your name." But the Lord said to Ananias, "Go. This man is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel. I will show him how much he must suffer for my name." So God shows up to Ananias. He says, "Ananias, have you heard of this guy named Saul?" And Ananias is like, "Yes, I have heard of this guy. This is the psychopath who's like killing people like Stephen and terrorizing the church. I have heard of Saul." And God says, "Great. I want you to go to his house where he's staying, knock on his door, and I want you to lay your hands on him and pray for him." And Ananias is like, "No way. I am not doing that," right? Think about how that's going to go for Ananias. He's going to go to the house of the guy who wants to kill him, knock on his door and say, "Hey, I'd love to pray for you." This is going to be the end for this guy, right? And what he does is he doesn't just argue with God. He doesn't sit there and reason with God. He goes. Now, if he's anything like me, he probably goes grumbling under his breath saying, "I don't know, God, if you can really use this kind of guy, can you really use Saul?" I remember working at a job years ago, and I remember one of my coworkers got promoted to a position that I just never imagined them in. And when they got promoted, I thought, you're going to put them in this position? This is going to go terribly wrong, right? And this is probably what Ananias is thinking. Ananias never would have thought that God would use Saul. He had no category for a God who would use a murderer. He never thought that God would use a guy terrorizing his church, but God said, Ananias, go and pray for him. I've got to imagine this wasn't the prayer ministry he signed up for. This wasn't the volunteer position that he signed up and raised his hand to be a part of, and yet he goes. And to make things better, God reassures him, don't worry. I spoke to Saul in a vision, and I told him your name, and I told him you're going to come here and pray for him. He's like, great. You've put my name on the mind of the guy who's come here to kill me. This is fantastic. And with little information, Ananias goes. But what we need to understand is that when God says go, he's already gone before us. He's already preparing the ground, preparing the way. What Ananias doesn't realize is that not only has God showed up and talked to Saul, but he's already blinded him. So if this guy wants to hurt Ananias, he's going to have a really difficult time doing that if he can't see. See, when God says go, he's already gone before us. But we often miss the miracle because when God says go, we don't go. We've all been here. Ananias was probably wondering, God, like, is this you? Like, is this really you speaking to me? Or maybe, is this a test? You just want to see if, like, I'm willing to go, but you don't actually want me to go because you wouldn't actually call me to do something beyond my capacity, would you? Right? Like, maybe he's like, God, if this is you, make the phone ring right now, right? Like, he's like testing God. God, if this is you, give me the warm fuzzies. You know, he's just getting all jacked up. God, if this is you, prove it, right? But we often argue with God. We make excuses for not being obedient and not going when God says go. And we even do this for ourselves. We don't think that God can really use anyone. We make hoops that we want people to jump through. We have certain qualifications for who we think God can use because deep down we think that God can only use perfect people. And we do this to ourselves, don't we? We think that God can't use us because we're not good enough. Years ago, there was a young girl named Amy Carmichael. And Amy Carmichael, when she was a young girl, wished that she had blue eyes. She was born with brown eyes, and because of that, she didn't think that she was beautiful. And she thought to herself, God, why did you give me brown eyes? Why couldn't you make me beautiful? Why couldn't I have blue eyes? And years later, when she was about 20 years old, God called her to be a missionary in India. And because she had brown eyes, she could dye her skin by bathing in coffee and tea. And she could dress like the locals and minister to the people there in India. See, we often write ourselves off so easily. We think to ourselves, if only I was different, then God could use me. But God can use anyone. See, we think that we're too old or too broken or too sinful. We think that we're not smart enough or talented enough or spiritual enough. We think that because we're introverted or depressed or broken that God can't use us. See, maybe you've written yourself off from being used by God and you even have a good excuse. One of the things that I've come to realize is that the devil will derail our lives by giving us really good excuses for why God can't use us. The devil will give you a bulletproof reason for why God can't use you. You're too old, you've been divorced, you're stuck in sin, you don't have it all together, you don't have what it takes. If anyone had a good excuse for why God couldn't use them, it was Saul. He was a murderer. He was terrorizing the church. He was destroying lives and families. He was persecuting individuals. Saul would have been the modern equivalent of a terrorist, and yet God used him. And God can use you. God used Noah, who was a drunk. He used Abraham, who slept with his wife's servant. He used David, who murdered a guy to cover up his affair. He used Job in his depression. He used Matthew, who betrayed his people and robbed them. He used a prostitute, uneducated fishermen, and sinners, and he can use you. See, Saul was brilliant. He was a brilliant, well-spoken Bible teacher. And God used him. See, when God saved Saul, he would use his knowledge about the Bible that he used against the church, and he would use it to build the church. You know, when I was younger, in school, if you were anything like me, I would get in a lot of trouble for goofing off, right? And I would get in trouble for like talking to my friends in class, and my teacher would like sit me down and say, Dan, you need to sit there and be quiet and not talk to your friends so that, you know, you can learn and one day get a job. And I wish I could go back now because I'm like, I now get paid to do what I used to get in trouble for in school. I now get paid to speak in public, and I used to get in trouble for that in school. See, Saul would have had the Old Testament memorized. He would have understood the different interpretations of the law, the different commentators and teachers and different interpretations. He studied under one of the greatest rabbis of his time. And God used this. God literally took the thing that made Saul unusable and used it as one of his greatest strengths. He was at the top of his class. He was the greatest arguer against the way of Jesus, but now he is the greatest arguer for the way of Jesus. See, you might have said no to God 1,000 times. You might have done terrible things. You might be the last person in the world that you think would ever be used by God. But God can use you. And what's crazy about Saul is he was working so hard. He was working so hard, and yet he was getting nowhere. See, the reality is that you can work really hard and miss God's will for your life. A few years ago, I was doing carpentry, which is a really bad idea for me. Terrible at anything with my hands, okay? And I'm working with my brother-in-law, Reed, and we're framing these walls inside of this house that we're doing a reno in. And when I say we, I mainly mean Reed, and I was just there to, emotional support, right? And so we're framing these walls, and at the end of the day, we get a call from our dad, and he tells us, the walls look great. You just built one of them in the wrong place, and you have to come back and fix the wall the next day. And the reality is that we can work really hard and get nowhere. We can work really hard and miss God's will for our life. And Saul was working really hard and getting nowhere. But when Saul meets Jesus, everything changes. What he's living for changes. What he's working for changes. Now, did Ananias know that when he went and told Saul about Jesus, it would result in one of the greatest missionaries of his time? Did he know that Saul would go on to write 3/4 of the New Testament? Did he know that he would bring the gospel to places like Asia and Europe? Did he know that he would stand before Caesar, the most powerful man alive, and proclaim the good news of Jesus? Did he know that Paul would later start churches, do miracles, and see thousands of people come to Christ because him and his timidity would go and tell Saul about Jesus? Probably not. But he was willing to go, and as a result, Saul was used by God. Listen, God can use anyone. He can use a timid disciple, and he can use a murderer who's working against the cause of Christ. And if that's true, God can use you. It goes on to say in verse 17, then Ananias went to the house and entered it. Placing his hand on Saul, he said, Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus who appeared to you on the road as you were coming here has sent me so that you may see again and be filled with the Holy Spirit. Immediately something like scales fell from Saul's eyes and he could see again. He got up and was baptized. And after taking some food, he regained his strength. Saul spent several days with the disciples in Damascus. So not only can God save anyone, not only can God use anyone, but God can transform anyone. It goes on to say in verse 20, here's the last few verses. At once, or right away, or immediately, he began to preach in the synagogues that Jesus is the Son of God. This is a night and day switch. This is radical transformation. It says in verse 21, all those who heard him were astonished and asked, isn't he the man who raised havoc in Jerusalem among all those who call on his name? And hasn't he come here to take them as prisoners to the chief priests? Yet Saul grew more and more powerful and baffled the Jews living in Damascus by proving that Jesus is the Messiah. After many days had gone by, there was a conspiracy among the Jews to kill him. But Saul learned of their plan, and day and night they kept close watch of the city gates in order to kill him. But his followers took him by night and lowered him in a basket through an opening in the wall. When he came to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were afraid of him. I love that. Not believing that he really was a disciple. Laurel and I, when we started dating, there was one summer, we just started dating, maybe a few weeks into things, and she went on a family trip during the summer. And so I thought it'd be a good move to make her like a care package so that, she'd think of me and she wouldn't forget about me, while she's gone. And so I packed this care package full of different things. And among many things, I include M&Ms and popcorn. Like, those are like the greatest snacks ever invented. And the interesting thing is that many times before, Laurel told me, hey, I'm allergic to dairy. I can't eat dairy. And so I thought it'd be a great idea. Milk chocolate M&Ms and buttered popcorn. Great idea. Although she had told me that many times, she didn't hold that against me. She didn't let that moment define the way that she saw me. See, listen to me. God doesn't let your sin define you. He won't let your sin define you. He will not let your darkest moment become your identity. Opposed to popular belief, your primary identity, the truest thing about you, is not that you are a sinner. See, God defined you the moment that he created you in his image. And it is true that we do sin and that we are sinners, but it is not the truest thing about you. See, the reality is that God can transform anyone. See, what's really fascinating about this story is how Saul responds to Jesus. He does two things. The first thing is he calls Jesus Lord. The Greek word there is kurios. He says, Jesus, you are Lord. But the second thing he does is he responds in obedience to Jesus. He does what he says. See, Saul didn't just believe or have faith. He calls Jesus Lord and does what he says. See, sometimes in the church, we simplify things too much, and we say that it's just about having the right doctrine. It's just about believing a certain set of ideas about Jesus. But the problem is that goes against what the very word faith actually means. The Greek word faith comes from a word pistis, which means to have faithfulness to or allegiance to something. It's better translated as faithfulness to Jesus. And what's interesting is that the word faith means living like what you believe is true. Faith is living like what you believe is true. So Saul calls Jesus Lord, and he does what he said. See, Jesus says this, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. He also says, why do you call me Lord, Lord? Why do you just believe the things about me and do not do what I say? See, Saul didn't just believe, he was transformed. He responds in both faith and obedience. See, Saul called Jesus Lord and did what he said. This is where transformation happens. And what happens is he's transformed. The persecutor of the church becomes the persecuted. See, what happens in the story is that people, after he starts telling people about Jesus, he has to run away because they want to kill him. They want to persecute him. And so his followers lower him in a basket out the wall so he can run away. Imagine this. The irony is that the great missionary journey of the Apostle Paul starts with him running away in fear of those who want to persecute him. The persecutor becomes the persecuted. And what I want us to understand this morning, if you're following Jesus this morning, God can transform you. If you're thinking about following Jesus, Jesus can transform you. See, God even uses Saul's past. One of the things that we know about Saul, because he writes about it over and over in his letters to the churches, is that he was a Roman citizen. We don't know how he became a Roman citizen, but there's two theories that I want to introduce you to this morning. The first is that Saul's parents and family were tent makers for the Roman army, which means they betrayed their own people and made tents for the enemy, for the Roman Empire and their army. And after they do this, maybe they became Roman citizens. That's one theory. Another theory is that his family were slaves in the Roman Empire. And it happened during that time that when you became a slave and you were released, you were given Roman citizenship. Either way, God transforms Saul's past in a really powerful way. I'm going to assume that whatever Saul's past was, it wasn't something that he was necessarily proud of. Either betraying your own people or being a slave is something that would have been part of his painful past, part of his painful history. And yet God uses even the pain of Saul's past to bring about good. See, God will use the broken parts of you, the parts of you that you're not proud of, the parts of you that are too hard to think about, because God will use yesterday's scars to bring about tomorrow's healing. Saul used his citizenship to advance the message of Jesus. It was his citizenship that allowed him to stand before Caesar and proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. God used his past. He transformed him and used it for good. See, God can use anyone. He can save anyone. And he can transform anyone. So this morning, how do you need to respond? Is there somebody that you've written off and you think God could never save them? Or maybe you're here this morning and you think, I'm too sinful, I'm too broken, I've done too much things that I'm not proud of. There's no way that God could save me. And you need to hear Romans 5:8, that even while you were still a sinner, Christ died for you. Or maybe this morning you're stuck in a particular area in your life. You're stuck in sin, or you need to change something. The reality is that the gospel is not just good advice, it's good news, and it's the power of God unto salvation. And it doesn't just save you from something in eternity, but it saves you from sin right here and right now. Jesus proclaims to us in 1 John chapter 1 that Jesus came to undo the works of the devil. So if you're here and you're stuck in sin and you want to be transformed, the good news of the gospel is God can transform anyone. So I think we all need to respond this morning to either be saved, to be used by God, or to be transformed by God. So we're going to sing, we're going to worship, we're going to respond. We would love to pray for you if we can pray for you in any way. But let's pray.